Hello, everyone, and thank you for your patience. We were working through some technical issues up here, but I think we are ready to get started. We're glad to have all of you here in the room, as well as those of you joining us online on the live stream. And again, thanks for your patience. I'm Heather Goldstone. I'm Chief Communications Officer at Woodwell Climate Research Center. We are an organization that conducts science for solutions at the nexus of climate, people, and nature. And we partner with both communities and leaders for just meaningful impact to address the climate crisis. And today we're thrilled to be partnering with Global Choice's Arctic Angels program to bring you this really powerful panel about the intertwining fates of landscapes and peoples, communities from the Arctic to the Amazon and to the African continent, because climate change obviously is a global problem. We tend to often break it up, and our decision-making processes as well as our scientific studies are often focused on specific geographic regions, but it's really important to remember that all of these systems are connected, and that of course we are connected over generations and through time as well, and that's really what we hope to share with you today. So we are going to start. I have some questions for our panelists, and then we will open it up for audience Q&A as well. So to kick things off, I first want to turn to Sally Ranney, who is the co-founder and president of Global Choices, the organization that runs Arctic Angels program. And Sally, I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about the dramatic changes in the Arctic that we are seeing, and that your organization is particularly concerned about and working on at this point.
Well, thank you. I'm very pleased and honored to be here today, and I want to share some of what Global Choices is concerned about in the Arctic, because it is an apex climate system and part of the cryosphere, which is one of the 5 Earths. Yes, the right word to say is that it's headed toward collapse if we do not act urgently on emissions reductions. And when I say that, what has happened since 1979, since NASA has been tracking the ice shield, could I have the, there we go. This is what has happened between 1979 and this last photo is 2020, August of 2020. Summer in the Arctic is end of August, September. And that's the summer retreat of the ice. And so what we've been doing is raising the alarm. Next slide, please. And the reason that we're all here today is because the impacts of what is happening to the Arctic, and in particular the Arctic sea ice. The sea ice reflects the sun's heat and radiation back into the atmosphere. And when you lose the sea ice, you lose that reflection. And so it impacts the whole cryosphere system, and it impacts all the other systems, as well as obviously the Amazon and Africa. So if you look at this quickly, B is the Arctic, represents Arctic and the Arctic sea ice. And if you note, every single arrow that comes from the B connects with all the other arrows. So these tipping points that have been scientifically identified are linked to what happens in the Arctic. There's a saying, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So it's a trigger. It's a trigger point for these other tipping points on the planet. And that's why we're so concerned about it. The next thing, the next slide, please. This is why it matters. It really matters. It's affecting people and animals locally, as far as the droughts in Pakistan, the floods in Pakistan, Eastern Africa droughts. It's affecting the Amazon and indigenous people in the Amazon. And crops in China. The drought in China has been linked, there's a lot of studies yet to be done, but has been linked to what's happening in the ice shield. Next slide. So what we're focused on is actually bringing a focus to the Arctic. And that is, we're proposing, where you see the ice retreats in the summer, we're proposing that there be a moratorium, a 10-year moratorium on the Central Arctic Ocean. And the Central Arctic Ocean, interestingly enough, is non-jurisdictional, which means nobody owns it. In the law of the sea, the UN law of the sea, it says that these high seas areas are basically global commons. The heritage of mankind is the language, belongs to everyone. However, just given what I showed you briefly, what's happening there is there are designs in this very fragile system to deep seabed mine, oil and gas exploration, the possibility of radioactive waste dumping, shipping lanes right across the North Pole, the possibility of seismic blasting, because that's a precursor of oil and gas exploitation. And so, and the deep seabed mining, they already know that there are nodules in a particular area called the Gakii Ridge. So, we're proposing a 10-year moratorium that would be a precautionary pause for science to catch up, for policy to catch up, for deep emission cuts to get in place, kick into place. Now, the last thing I want to say on that is that the ice responds, the sea ice responds a little bit differently than some of the other systems, in that it responds relatively quickly to more or less GHGs, and including obviously CO2. So since 1979, with that tracking, satellite tracking, we've seen how much ice, sea ice we've lost in relationship to the rise in ppms. Similarly, if we get the emissions down to 1.5 and even below that, even though we know there's going to be an overshoot, the sea ice could, if there's enough left, could restore itself. So that's what we are focused on, and we have an international network of young women, Arctic Angels, who are working on this issue and advocating for this moratorium, for countries to sign on to this, because it really is in their own best interest, regardless of where they're located. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. So, Sally, you mentioned that what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. I want to turn to our next panelist, Dr. Sue Natali. She's Director of the Arctic Program at Woodwell Climate Research Center and co-lead of the Permafrost Pathways project, focused on a different aspect of the Arctic and the cryosphere, and that is permafrost. So, Sue, can you tell us a little bit about permafrost and its importance both locally within the Arctic, I guess that's not really local, that's regionally within the Arctic, and globally to our climate system?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Heather. So I'm going to take us onto Arctic lands now. So this is a map of the current distribution of the permafrost region. So we're looking down at the Earth from the north. And so just to let, permafrost is permanently frozen ground. It underlies about 15% of the northern hemisphere land area. And partly because of the loss of sea ice, warming in the Arctic has been amplified. So Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. And so the Arctic has already surpassed 2 degrees Celsius warming. So that's something that's important to keep in mind. This permanently frozen ground is critically important to the people. There's about 5 million people who live in the Arctic. It provides infrastructure for people's homes. It provides food storage. It defines the habitat, vegetation, and wildlife that covers Arctic lands. Permafrost is also important globally because it stores a lot of carbon. So there's about 1.5 trillion tons of carbon stored in permafrost. Can you go back, Heather, to the first one? Yep. About 1.5 trillion tons of carbon stored in permafrost. As that permafrost thaws, go to the next one. This is what we can expect under high emission scenarios. We may lose up to 70% of the current distribution of permafrost. And so as that permafrost thaws, and it's happening now, people who are living on permafrost are losing their homes. Can you go back, Heather? Yeah, losing lands, and then this is also impacting carbon that can be released into the atmosphere. So that carbon, once the permafrost thaws, that carbon can be broken down as greenhouse gases released to the atmosphere, leading to more warming and additional thaw. So the one thing I want to point out on this picture, you can see this extreme level of loss of permafrost impacting the lifeways of people in the Arctic and also everyone globally. But this does not have to be our future. So this is permafrost distribution. If we are on our current trajectory or an RCP 8.5 trajectory, this 70% loss can be greatly reduced to about 25% loss if we drastically reduce our fossil fuel emissions. Okay, next slide. And so this is just an example of what it looks like. If your home is built on permafrost, you see in this example, the ground is starting to sink. People are putting blocks underneath their home to raise it up so that their houses don't flood. That structure is now gone. And people are doing this in many, many cases without very, very limited government support. And so it means like jacking your house up multiple times a year in order to protect yourselves from permafrost thaw. Permafrost thaw also is often accompanied by flooding and erosion because as that ground thaws, it becomes less stable, meaning that when you have coastal storms, it now is more vulnerable to being lost to those coastal storms. The ground can also sink lower, as you see in this house, so now you're having increased flooding. We're working with a number of communities, Alaska Native communities, who are making really extremely difficult decisions about where and how to live in order to protect themselves from permafrost thaw. And this is happening across the Arctic. And so it's really important to keep in mind that this is not a problem of the future, that this is something that's been going on for decades. Next slide. This is another example. This is a picture from the native village of Nunapachuk, and you see this is what happens when the ground thaws. This was a staircase that's just starting to collapse and flood. Permafrost thaw is impacting roadways, runways. Many of these communities, the only way in and out is to fly in and out of these communities, and as runways start to collapse and flood, there's no way to bring in resources. Next slide. And finally, just to focus on the global impact. So, as I said, there's a lot of carbon stored in permafrost. As the permafrost thaws, that carbon can be released into the atmosphere. There's a range of possibilities of how much carbon will come out when permafrost thaws. That carbon is coming out in the form of carbon dioxide and methane. But even at the low range, by the end of this century, greenhouse gas emissions from thawing permafrost will be on par with some major greenhouse gas emitting nations, perhaps even larger than emissions from the United States. And the big issue here, or one of the many issues here, is that these carbon emissions from thawing permafrost, which is on par with many large global greenhouse gas emitting nations, currently aren't incorporated. When we're thinking about how much carbon do we have in order to remain below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius or whatever the criteria are that seems appropriate. And so if we're not accounting for this major greenhouse gas emitting nation, the nation of permafrost, then our efforts to stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, we're not aiming for the right place. So our efforts are off, and we're never going to make those targets if we don't account for this important greenhouse gas emitting nation. And so I say the two messages, or few messages. One is to recognize this is happening now. Communities that are living on permafrost need support. These communities have contributed the least to climate change, and also we need to start accounting for the global impacts of permafrost thaw, because the situation will be worse if we don't. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sue. So with more emissions, obviously becomes more warming, accelerated warming driven by this feedback loop of Arctic warming, and those impacts are felt everywhere. And so I would like to turn to you. Sharon Gakii is a Kenyan climate activist and a member of Arctic Angels. And Sharon, I wonder if you could share with us some of the impacts that you have been seeing in your community and in your home country of Kenya, and why you personally feel that it's so important in your climate activism to connect what you're seeing in Kenya to what is happening in the Arctic.
Well, I must start by saying that melting of Arctic ice in Arctic Ocean is caused by the climate change. And therefore, this melting, it serves as a warning to the whole world. Because one, the ice in the Arctic Ocean, it serves as a regulator of temperatures in the regions which fall in the tropical region, as well as it regulates the climate, it helps in regulating the climate change. It regulates the climate. And so most of the countries that are affected by the melting of ice in the Arctic Ocean are countries which fall in the tropical region, as I have said. And these countries are most of the countries that are in the global south. And therefore, Africa falling in the global south, it is exposed mostly in the triple planetary crisis. These planetary crises are such as floods, which are being experienced right now in Nigeria. These floods has it has displaced more than 1,000 people from their homes. As I speak right now back home, we are experiencing a drought that has never been experienced in 40 years' time. And therefore, people has lost their livelihoods. Animals in the world has been exposed to deaths due to these droughts. And for example, as you can see in your screen, weeks ago we lost the oldest elephant in the world that was found in Amboseli Forest National Park. And this was a cause of drought. And therefore, we people in the global south, we are activating for the protection of the Arctic ice, because as much as it is happening in the Arctic, it is affecting us people in the global south, in Africa as well.
Sharon, I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about the issue of loss and damage as well. That is such clearly an important theme at this particular COP, and relates very much to the impacts that you were just talking about.
So speaking of loss and damage, for example, people who have lost their lives for example, in floods, a child that was asleep and they were swept away by floods and they were killed. We cannot bring these lives back. The people who have lost their livestock, these livestock cannot be brought back. And so, as much as we are talking about the adaptation, we cannot adapt into the loss that has been caused by the drought, the loss that has been caused, and the animals that have died. We cannot bring these animals back. We cannot bring these lives back. And so, loss and damage, it has affected us so much that we are the people who are most affected.
I want to turn to our next panelist, Dr. Glenn Bush, who is a scientist at Woodwell Climate Research Center, an economist who has been working in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for many years. And Glenn, while African nations are among those being most impacted by warming at this point, African nations are also the source of potential climate solutions, in particular with the massive forests of the Congo River Basin. I wonder if you could give us a sense of the importance, the Congo River Basin forest being the second largest intact rainforest in the world, the first being the Amazon. Together, those two, what is in the climate sense, the importance of these tropical forests, and what do we need to do to actually be able to protect these?
Thanks, Heather. So I think what I just heard was we can't adapt our way out of climate change. We must protect what we've got today. Tropical forests globally hold back about 1 degree Celsius of warming. So they're incredibly important to keep intact. Oh, get closer, sorry. Shall I start again? No? Yeah, okay. I think that's better. I just heard basically that we can't adapt our way out of climate change. We've got to keep what we've got intact now. Tropical forests globally are responsible for preventing about 1 degree C of climate warming. And this is particularly down to extensive primary old growth forests found in the tropics, but also in other parts of the world, in the temperate and boreal regions too. But protecting these primary old growth forests is absolutely essential to stay within the carbon budgets and keep us below these critical temperature thresholds of 1.5 or 2 degrees C, within timeframes meaningful to human development. So, in a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, basically, you've got a country that's about the same size as Western Europe, with very, very low levels of infrastructure development. There are no roads that go from north to south or east to west. You've got over 75 million people living largely rural livelihoods. A large proportion of their GDP comes from agriculture. And, these are households that are very, very vulnerable to climate change. And keeping these forests intact is also extraordinarily important for their resiliency in the future. But at the same time, what other resources do they have to live a meaningful and fulfilled life? So essentially, the drivers of deforestation in this region are primarily from smallholder slash-and-burn agriculture. And so this is millions of households clearing small parcels of land every year, amounting to millions of hectares of deforestation over time. So, they're incredibly vulnerable. What can we do to help? Well, there's all sorts of proposals on the table. Basically, through international financial transfers, through the global development mechanisms, carbon markets, all these things are on the table. And we need to think creatively of mechanisms to help people in some of the most vulnerable conditions and the poorest conditions on Earth have access to some of this financing so they can transform their livelihoods.
Thank you, Glenn. And last but not least, I want to turn to our final panelist, Xiye Bastida, who is a Mexican climate activist, an organizer for Fridays for the Future, and co-founder of the Re-Earth Initiative, and of course a member of Arctic Angels. And Xiye, I wonder if you could share with us some of the experiences that drive your activism and how you see aspects of climate justice and intergenerational justice interwoven with this issue of connecting Arctic and tropics?
Thank you so much to all the panelists for sharing your expertise and also your stories. This is a picture of my hometown when it suffered from flooding back in 2015. And what I was sharing beforehand is that this is just one aspect of how the climate crisis impacts communities. Because before having the climate impacts, we also have the extractivist industries, and we also have the polluting industries in our communities. So we are seeing, first the impacts of Mexico City taking away our water, then the impacts of factories putting waste into our river, and then the impacts of a warming world, which is these climate disasters. We are living in the perfect storm of everything going wrong in the global south. And the most important thing is that indigenous communities are actually responsible of most of the protection of the world's biodiversity. So if we want to protect biodiversity and our global ecosystems, we need to protect the defenders. This right here, the climate clock, is counting down the time for how long we have until we need to reduce our emissions to stay in line with the Paris Agreement. It also shows the amount of land protected by indigenous communities. And that has to keep growing and growing because the expertise on how to live in harmony with Mother Earth is something that has been missing from the global conversation. And now the question that I pose is, how can we take this expertise, this knowledge, and this wisdom and pair it with all of the research and the legal language needed to merge these two worlds into something in which a third one is born, a third one where we are applying and implementing all of the promises that are being held at COPs like these. One of the interesting things about what we have touched upon today is the Arctic, the tropics, all of these are global systems, which means that we need global agendas and global treaties to protect all of these systems. So the Arctic moratorium that Sally mentioned is very important because it has no jurisdiction. So we need to think of how do we go and overcome these issues of the sovereignty of the countries to protect the greater global commons. Other things that we've been working on are ecocide law. So how do we criminalize the destruction of nature? Because it has to be said, every single ecosystem that is being destroyed has a company behind it and a name behind it. And we are here to call that out and to say all of these regulations have to be implemented to safeguard the global commons. We also are talking a lot about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Vanuatu and Tuvalu just signed. This treaty is to stop the proliferation of fossil fuels. It has to stop. We also had a lot of talks about the carbon markets, and the truth is that all of these false offsets also have to stop because we're just shuffling emissions around and nothing is being reduced. If we want to achieve all of our climate goals, we need to think in this global way, and how do we apply these global treaties to our national policies. The last one is, I was just in a panel about oceans, and there's also an ocean treaty, which is actually our great connector, and it's greatly influenced by the Arctic, and it greatly influences the tropics as well. So all of the things that we've been talking about is basically different sides of a same shared agenda, which is how do we do everything we can through every single sector to protect the balance of this planet. And we as youth are being able to see this shape and how everything is interconnected. And that is really the main message that everybody here has to hear, because we have stakeholders in policy, in finance, working with youth, in education, in investment. But we will not get anywhere if something gets voted on for here but strike down here. And that is what's happening in negotiations. Countries go into a room and say, we support loss and damage, and then go into the next room and say, we don't want a finance facility for loss and damage. So these are the things that we need to be championing. Everybody in this room and beyond needs to be vocal about all of these different treaties that are actionable. As you can see in the screen, these are the three main things that youth are focusing on: adaptation, loss and damage, and finance, the three negotiation tracks that are the most important for us. We've been following all of this closely. And, I think we need to break the the notion that youth are just here as symbols of the future, because we're also here as stakeholders, and we're also here to hold space and share our stories. The last thing I'll share is that we just launched the Fossil Free Pledge, where youth are pledging to never work for the fossil fuel industry. And I think those pledges can be extended. Youth pledging to also, for example, sign individual Arctic moratoriums. Youth pledging to always talk about loss and damage in these spaces, so that the global south can be protected. So that is just a quick run through on the things that we've been working on, and I hope that we all become more vocal and articulated about how all of the systems really are one, interacting, and we need to be able to imagine that better world, and who better to imagine that better world than the youth who bring a fresh perspective and creativity. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiye, and yes, such an important perspective and voice, not simply symbolic. Of course, the full responsibility should not rest on the shoulders of youth activists. And Glenn, I want to come back to you and the work that you've done in communities in the DRC. The goal is really to build systems that are long-term thinking, that the goal is to preserve ecosystems and to advance these communities and their values, and often that comes back to wanting a better life for their children. So can you talk a little bit about what you hear in those communities and how we might start to design systems that actually work in that way?
Yeah, so a lot of my work is really focused on better understanding the livelihoods of forest-based communities, where they get their sources of income from, how they use it, how they want to invest it to make a better life for themselves and their families. And a critical thing that I see constantly is investment in education. Parents today don't want the same sort of lives, the hard lives that they lead in these forest environments for their children. And so they're hugely invested in education. But with that education comes skills to be able to develop and build enterprises. And so also, these investments in rural development to help people cope with climate change and also adopt more forest-friendly farming practices has to look at a range of different sort of interventions, ranging from education to market facilitation, trying to help people make more from the land they've got, get better value from it. And when I talk about education, it's not just education for children, it's also adult education, capacity building, training in agriculture. One of the critical opportunities that people see is that they're facing constant declines in agricultural output. So dealing with the agricultural yield gap brings a critical opportunity to improve food outputs, both for home consumption as well as sale on local markets, without needing to deforest more. So we need real solid investment in the infrastructure to support rural development, particularly in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which have seen 40 years of fairly persistent decline and are now struggling to set up a stable platform for growth.
Great. So Sue and then Sally, each of you in your opening comments spoke to some of what needs to change in terms of policy around the Arctic. And I wonder if we could just circle back to that. And Sue, I'll start with you. You mentioned that emissions are not being taken into account. So what do we need to do there? And what do we need to be doing to support the communities that are already feeling the impacts of permafrost loss?
Okay, so the two, if we think of the permafrost thaw in terms of two impacts, one global impact and the second is sort of local, regional. Well, in terms of the global impact, I can't see the clock, but my guess is the clock is probably running slow. And the reason is because it's not accounting for important biological feedbacks, including permafrost thaw. And so the first thing we need to do is to get the science into that accounting right there. And what that means is that we need more ambition for reducing our fossil fuel emissions, because where we're aiming for now, that's my guess is that needs to be recalibrated. The second thing we need to do is provide support for communities in the global north. Indigenous communities in the Arctic are losing their land because of permafrost thaw, and we're not, the nations, such wealthy nations like the United States, where some of these indigenous communities are sort of within, aren't providing support that's needed for these communities who are losing land as a result of permafrost thaw, as a result of erosion. And so I think there needs to be financial support, and there also needs to be some governance and some guidance and some framework for how do communities that are being forced to relocate within their nations, where do they go and how does that happen? And right now it seems like this is a very urgent need, and there's very little, if any, guidance on how that needs to proceed.
And Sally, you mentioned the idea of a 10-year moratorium on the exploration of or use of sea ice areas.
Is it okay if I make a couple comments on
Yeah.
some things that have been said?
Yeah, go right ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on what Xiye and Sharon said, and that is if you were born in 1960, you are likely to experience 60% more extreme weather than prior to that time. If you're born today, you are more likely to experience 7 times that. So, considering that, the intergenerational piece is extremely important. Our generation has a responsibility, an ethical responsibility, to take care of this problem and join hands with the youth in order to do that, with so many of you in the room here. The other thing is that, yes, the stakeholders are global, but the stakeholders are all species. All species. Obviously, humans included, but all species. And the last thing in response is the shuffling of emissions, which Xiye was talking about, is one of the most interesting things, and this leads into policy about the sea ice shield, is that because it responds more quickly to less or more global GHGs, it actually is a real time. We can see it by satellite, what's happening. Actually, you can see it every month. You could see it every day, what's happening. So it's a real-time, data-driven metric to which we can hold global leaders accountable to more or less emissions, to their decisions. And in that, we need to talk about, in policy, whole systems and whole systems decision-making, because we have been making decisions very fragmented, in a very fragmented form, nation to nation, region to region, and now we understand that everything's connected to everything. It's systems. It's life support systems. And so we have to acknowledge that in our decision making. As far as these are all pieces that fit in to our proposal, to our moratorium. And they're a legal framework. You mentioned, Sue, you mentioned governance. There's a tremendous need for a new hybrid governance, pulling on a lot of precedents, that are legal precedents that are out there already, and some that are in the process, to form an honest reflection of who the stakeholders are in the global commons. And in our case, it's the high seas global commons. So that means that we have to have a lot of different approaches to this. And there has to be a confluence of these different legal opportunities, whether it's the rights of nature that's incorporated in it, or other systems. We have not seen, and it hasn't been created yet, the kind of governance that we need for the global commons.
Sharon, I wonder if you could also comment on what it is that you would like to see governments, Global South, and more broadly, doing to address the kinds of impacts that you were sharing with us earlier, and what some of the obstacles to that might be that we should all be aware of and working to break down.
So I would love to see governments in the global south cut emissions and adjust to transition of clean energy as well as land planning. I would also love the governments to encourage people to increase afforestation to reduce degradation of lands. And I would give an example of my government. Our country, our president has promised that in the year, like, we will be having 50 million trees being planted in the country. This encourages people to do the planting and reduce the deforestation. And therefore, there will be a token, or I might say awards, to the people who will be doing the more planting of the trees. So I would encourage most of the governments in the global south to do this to increase the afforestation and reduce the degradation of lands.
Thank you all. So we do have time to take questions from the audience, and I believe we have a microphone that we can bring to folks, a wireless microphone. So if there are questions in the audience, we would love to take those. Yes, microphone, please. Just 1 second, we'll get you a microphone.
Numbers. Thank you. So, yeah, I work at the Climate Clock, so I can confirm the numbers are from the IPCC report. And my understanding from the IPCC report is that most positive feedback loops are not included in these forecasts. Like, just the scariest part of climate change, I think. But so why is that? How do we get these numbers and the effects of the Arctic and so forth into these numbers and forecasts, so people see what really is going to happen to our futures? All
right, thanks for the question, and I would love to chat about if we can recalibrate
please.
the clock. So I think getting it into the IPCC, we want that to happen before the next report, because we're thinking 7 years down the line, and that's a little bit too late. So I think there's other ways of getting the information out there, even if we don't have to do this sort of waiting for AR7 to come out. So why aren't these feedbacks in the IPCC reports? Because science is slow, because these models were not, permafrost was not built into these models. So of the Earth system models that went into the last IPCC report, I think 88% of them don't have permafrost carbon included, because they just weren't built into the models. The climate is now changing faster than the science can to keep up with it. Even the models that do include permafrost don't include all the relevant processes, so they include permafrost thaw is this gradual process where the air gets warm and gradually heat goes down into the ground. But the reality of permafrost thaw is sometimes it happens that way. Other times you get really extreme ground collapse that can happen like really abruptly. And when that happens, that then leads to faster thawing and faster thawing. So it's a positive feedback when you have this abrupt thaw. The models don't include combustion of carbon below ground, and most of the carbon in the Arctic is below ground. It's not above ground. There's order of magnitude more carbon below ground, so the models don't include this below ground combustion. The models don't include interactions between wildfire and permafrost thaw, so wildfire leads to more thaw. So part of it is just the pace of the science that can be done. It's also the process of getting these, updating all of these models. It takes a long time. It takes funding. It takes commitment. And so I think as a scientist, like IPCC report is like, yes, let's get the models improved for the IPCC report, but it's also about communicating this science like as we know it now and not waiting 7 years for the next IPCC report. And I'd love to update that clock.
It's hard not having it if it's not in the gold standard, it's harder, but yes.
Yeah, but even, the IPCC report, by the times they come out, they're usually a few years outdated, right? Because, they take information from peer-reviewed literature, which is really key, but it sort of like closes a couple years before it comes out. So even when they come out, the latest science is already a few years back.
Are there other questions?
Heather, could I respond as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So I just would like to reiterate all of what Sue said is also true for the tropics. And so there are similar great holes in our knowledge about the functioning of these systems. And essentially, we can't manage what we can't measure. And, Sue talked about peer-reviewed literature, and particularly in the Congo Basin, it's just a big data black hole. We haven't been doing the type of research at the scale necessary to be able to say something meaningful. And so when you look in the IPCC report, there's essentially missing data about the contributions of the Central African tropical system to the whole climate system. So we need to make a big investment in training and capacity building for science in these regions so we can sort of close the gap. And that also then relates to the impacts of future climate change on the functioning of these systems. So, we need to know this so that we can understand what are the real priority threats now and responses we need to make. Because I think ultimately there are trade-offs to be made. We're never going to have all the money we need to protect all of these forests and all of these ecosystems. So where do we start? And, we need to prioritize protection, then management, then restoration of these landscapes.
Great. All right. Are there other questions in the audience? No. Are there any closing thoughts from our panelists? I'll just open it up. I think we've covered a lot of ground. We've given folks a lot of food for thought and a lot of potential action items. Put permafrost and a full accounting of forests into our carbon budgets and our climate policies. Be more ambitious in our emissions reductions. Protect Arctic ice. Manage our lands better. A big to-do list. We've got a lot of work to do. Yes, Xiye.
The last thing I'll say is, in this panel, you can see the importance of the science being able to be communicated to all these different sectors. And you are both wonderful scientific communicators, but there's a lot of science that gets not told and not seen. So I think that's just one more note on the importance of also having, for example, activists be communicators and be, the things that we say in the streets have real impact through the backing of data, through the backing of, timelines that are updated. So this is a call for everyone to, learn more about climate communication, how you can best engage in it, and also if you have any resources to share about where we can get data from. And my last call to action is for you to learn your climate story and really bring that emotional aspect to the climate crisis, because for the past 60 years, it's all been about measurements and, I don't know the difference between 3 million and 33 million people and 1 billion people being displaced, because it's hard to conceptualize. But once you tell the stories and you have the feelings, all the data becomes real. So that's just another thing that I think we can all walk out from COP with.
Great. Okay, I'll second that. I definitely appreciate listen to the scientists, and I think people should listen to the scientists. I think people should listen to the activists, and I also think we should be listening more to indigenous knowledge holders, indigenous scientists, because one, these are people who have been being impacted most by climate change, particularly in the Arctic, or at least in the space where I work, particularly in the Arctic. But also just these are people who have been living like with the land and have much better holistic understanding of this system. And so as a scientist, that's really critical for the work that I do, to have a better understanding of how this system is behaving now and how it's going to respond to the climate in the future. And so I would really like to see those voices elevated.
All right. Well, I think that's a particularly powerful call to action. Share your story and listen to each other. So a fabulous note, I think, to conclude our event. Thank you for everyone who joined us here in person, to everyone who joined us online as well. And we welcome you to come continue the conversation here, both here in person today, and you can use the QR codes that are on the screen to learn more and get in touch with both of our organizations. So thank you again to all of you. And another round of applause for our fabulous panel. Oh, Sharon, you wanted to jump in with one last thing?
Yeah, I feel that I should have said that whatever is happening in the Arctic, it doesn't stay in the Arctic alone. That's why people in the global south are being affected. And as much as our governments in the global south are doing so much to curb the impacts of climate crisis, we are calling for the people of the global north to curb down the climate crisis as well. We need them to pay up for the loss and damage that has been caused. This is a cry and a voice being represented from Africa, from Kenya. We are calling for the climate finance to be given to the people on the global south.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all again so much. A round of applause for our fabulous panelists today.